Hello, everyone, and welcome to Something to Talk About Live. My name is Liz Owen. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Director of Communications at pflagnation.al. It's great to have you with us again today for what I know is a very important and timely conversation, as always. So without any hesitation, let me bring in my colleague and my good friend, Jean Marie Nevada.
Liz Owen.
Jean Marie Nevada, how are you?
I'm doing well. I'm especially excited today because we are talking about my favorite law in the entire world.
I was going to say, your favorite topic.
You know, like if anybody could have a favorite law, like if you could marry a law, I would totally marry Title IX.
It would be your number one on your top 10 of favorite laws.
It totally would be. Like it just edges out Title VII by a little bit, but it's always going to be my favorite.
And I think that tells us everything we need to know about what a nerd you are for law when you have a top 10 favorite list of laws and not like songs or movies. It's laws.
And we have like somebody really, really great to talk about it. So I am beyond excited about today's conversation. Also, because it's a really important one that's changing and evolving so much.
Absolutely. Well, then I don't want to delay the conversation. I will leave you to it.
Thanks, Liz. Hey, everybody. My name is Jean Marie Nevada. My pronouns are she and ella. And I'm the Director of Learning and Inclusion at pflagnation.al. I am also apparently a huge nerd. Every single week we get together to talk about something related to LGBTQ equality and inclusion. And this week we are going to be talking about Title IX. So for those of you who are used to reading the article and grabbing some discussion questions, you can grab that at straightforequality.org/discussion series. And this week's article actually comes from The Hill. And the title is "The USDA says religious schools will be granted automatic Title IX exemptions." And to have a conversation about this, I actually wanted to go back a little bit, talk about the original intent of Title IX, what it has accomplished, where there have been some struggles, and what it means to us right now. And when it comes to talking about Title IX, there are very few better organizations to talk to than the National Women's Law Center. So I want to bring in our guest today, who is the Director of Justice for Student Survivors and Senior Counsel at National Women's Law Center, Shiwali Patel.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me to join you for this program.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm really, really excited, as you've probably already heard, my slight obsession with Title IX. So thank you for being here to help people understand, because I feel like it's one of those laws that a lot of people at its core don't understand. And then now they really don't understand what's happening now. So before we even get started on that, can you quickly tell people a little bit about National Women's Law Center?
Sure. So the National Women's Law Center was actually founded the same year that Title IX was passed in 1972. So, since then, which 50 years ago, we have been working on Title IX issues, which has always been central and core to our work in advocacy. But we've also been advocating for gender equity in various spheres of our lives, which includes access to healthcare and abortion, income security, childcare, workplace, and then education, where our Title IX work lives. And we do this work or advocacy through litigation, policy changes, and culture change. And we also run a legal network for gender equity. And through it also the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund, which connects people who've experienced sex discrimination in the workplace or in education and in healthcare with attorneys across the country.
And the work that NWLC does is it's so good, and it's been so consistent, and it's just evolved so nicely over the years because these conversations have changed a lot. So this week we are talking about Title IX, and in spite of the fact that it's 50 years old, it's been around since 1972, a lot of people don't understand it. I know that sometimes when I say it, people look at me and they're like, isn't that the law that lets girls play softball? And I'm like, no, it's a little bit, but no. So at its very core, could you explain to people what Title IX is and what its original intent was?
Yeah, so I'm so glad you asked this question because, even before I understood what Title IX really was, I thought it had to really only do with sports. And it does include sports, but it's so much more than that. Like Title VII as a law, it's just 37 words long, but it's broad, and it's about ensuring that no one is excluded from participation in or denied the benefits of or discriminated against in any education program or activity because of their sex. And the Supreme Court has repeatedly recognized that Title IX has broad coverage. So it's intended to be a broadly applied law. It covers recruitment, it covers admissions, it covers financial aid and scholarships, facilities and housing, course offerings, counseling, health insurance and benefits, athletics and extracurricular activities, employment, school climate, including sexual harassment. And it also addresses protections for LGBTQI plus students and for pregnant parenting students, including, which is very relevant now, given the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs, students who terminate their pregnancy. So while Title IX doesn't guarantee nor prohibit abortion access, it does grant students the right to learn in an environment free from discrimination based on their decision to obtain an abortion.
And so has it been successful? We know why it was brought into law, but has it worked? Has it really changed the game, so to speak, for students?
I mean, when it was enacted, it was mostly about allowing women and girls in schools. Before Title IX, women and girls were often excluded or had limited access to educational programs. Elite colleges and universities were setting quotas for admissions or prohibiting them for women, or prohibiting them from attending altogether, or required higher test scores of women in order to be admitted. And so, Title IX in many ways has been successful. There are more women and girls in college, more women in tenure track faculty positions, more women and girls playing school sports. However, sex discrimination in schools persists, right? The majority of college presidents are still men. Pregnant parenting students continue to be pushed out of school at high rates. LGBTQI plus students are facing an onslaught of attacks from discriminatory state laws. And sexual harassment in schools, in colleges and K-12 schools continues to be pervasive. And not to mention, the backlash that has emerged over the years whenever there's been progress made because of Title IX.
Yeah. And actually that brings me to sort of what the next piece of the conversation needs to be, which is the previous administration really messed around with Title IX. There were some changes made. What happened during the last administration when it came to Title IX, and what was the impact of some of those changes?
Yeah, so there was a lot that happened in the last administration. When the Trump administration began and Betsy DeVos became, Secretary of Education, they really turned the mission of the Department of Education, which is really at its core a civil rights agency, on its head. I think you may recall that one of the first actions within the first month of, DeVos's tenure at the Department of Ed, I think like mid-February 2017, they had rescinded guidance addressing protections for trans students. Guidance that wasn't even in effect for a year. That guidance came into effect in May 2016. It took years to develop through, meetings with stakeholders and students and families and advocates, research and following where the courts were going on this issue. And then the department under the Trump administration so quickly rescinded it. And then later that year, they rescinded Title IX protections addressing sexual harassment in schools. And so in 2020, the Trump administration made changes to the Title IX regulations. These are the rules from the Department of Education that really, provide more explanation on how the department enforces Title IX. The Trump administration changed the rule in a way that upended decades of Title IX policy and significantly weakened protections against sexual harassment in education, protections that existed since 1997. And what they do, because they are still in effect, unfortunately, is that they push schools to ignore more incidents of sexual harassment, and they require uniquely unfair, burdensome procedures for sexual harassment complaints. So, for example, the Trump administration changed the standard so that for harassment, schools can only investigate Title IX complaints if it meets a certain level of severity and pervasiveness. That means if it doesn't, schools can ignore those incidents. Yeah. And then they allow schools to ignore incidents based on the location of it, even if, schools are responding to other sorts of misconduct at the same location. So, for example, at an off-campus party, a school might be responding to underage drinking. or drug use. But now with the Title IX rule, they would be prohibited in some cases to respond to a sexual assault that occurs with the same party. And, ultimately with these changes, and there are a lot of them, and we've written a lot about this and actually sued the Department of Education on these Title IX changes, they're rooted in deeply offensive and sexist stereotypes and myths that label reports of sexual harassment as uniquely less credible than reports of other student or employee misconduct, therefore requiring special scrutiny of those reports. Now, that's kind of one set of change that was made in the Title IX rule around harassment. The other has to do with religious exemptions. So there were two different changes that were made in 2020, which assured religious institutions who do have, so let me go back a little bit. The Title IX statute, the law recognizes that for schools that are controlled by a religious institution, that they can be exempt from not all of Title IX, but certain parts of Title IX. Remember, it's so broad, right? To if those provisions conflict with their religious tenets of the organization that the school is controlled by. And so for years, institutions were submitting requests to the Department of Education in advance, basically, explaining how they're controlled by a religious organization and then how the Title IX provisions conflict with their tenets. And earlier on, there were institutions that wanted to, that sought an exemption because they didn't want to admit women into certain programs, or they, were discriminating against, students based on, if they had premarital sexual relations or, were accessing birth control. And then once the federal government started recognizing protections for LGBTQI plus students in around like 2013, so after, there were more exemptions sought to discriminate against LGBTQI plus students. And these letters were posted on the department's website. And there was pushback from institutions who claimed it was shaming them and they didn't want it to be exposed, that they had these policies and discriminatory beliefs and exemptions. So the department under the Trump administration responded by making it clear to religious institutions that they don't have to seek an exemption in advance. So that means that they could discriminate against a student who isn't aware that their school has this exemption. Their family's not aware. And so they're discriminated against, the student files a complaint to the department, then the institution can say, well, we're exempt. It assures institutions they could do that rather than letting people know in advance. And they made a separate change that allowed more institutions to claim that they are controlled by a religious organization, even if they aren't really controlled by a religious organization. It just means that more schools are entitled to the exemption.
Right. I think it's really interesting because looking at one of the cases that's pending now, one of the schools claimed that having to comply with Title IX would prohibit them from having students develop lifelong Christian character traits. And I'm like compliance with the law? One would think that would be a good character trait, but it's really interesting how this is being argued. So the Biden administration has issued clarifications and some changes to hopefully address what happened. So could you talk a little bit about what is happening right now in terms of, I think, trying to address some of that damage that was done, but also, I think, move the needle forward a little bit too?
Yeah. So what the Biden administration did is that they proposed changes to the Title IX rule on Title IX's 50th anniversary, actually, which was June 23rd. And these changes would restore protections against sexual harassment in schools. And do a lot of what the Trump administration did to, allow schools to ignore more reports and, respond in a way that was treating complaints of sexual harassment unfairly. And the Biden administration's proposed changes also make clear that discrimination against LGBTQI plus students is against the law and must not be tolerated or ignored. And they also ensure that pregnant parenting students receive greater support to complete their education. Now, what the rule doesn't do is it doesn't undo the religious exemption changes that I mentioned that were made in 2020, which we do hope that is something that they will address. And so, it's important to know that until the rulemaking process is finished, which could take a while. Unfortunately, the Trump rule remains in effect.
Yeah.
But so the comment period is open. I think I'll be talking about that later. But so that is a huge first step to the Biden administration's strengthening and restoring of Title IX protections. Separately and earlier, last June 2021, the Department of Ed issued a notice of interpretation explaining that it will enforce Title IX's prohibition on the basis of sex to include discrimination based on sexual orientation and discrimination based on gender identity. This was consistent with the decision that the Supreme Court came out with in Bostock in June 2020. But unfortunately, in July this year, there was a Tennessee District Court judge that preliminarily enjoined, so prohibited the department from enforcing that in 20 states because the judge claimed that it interfered with those states' ability to enforce their laws that discriminate against trans students when playing sports or using bathrooms consistent with their gender identity.
So basically there's a lot of work that needs to be done just to undo the damage that was done. We are by no means in the clear, and there are pending lawsuits. And I want to come back to those in a second, but I made a joke about loving Title IX a lot. I used to work on it in another professional life. And one of the things that I always found fascinating was, in many cases, the more conservative opposition to Title IX in general across the board, and it's been pretty historic. But lately, I would say far right opposition has suddenly become profound defenders of Title IX. It's really interesting reading some of the stuff that they are pushing out. In fact, becoming kind of advocates of Title IX as a tool to protect women and girls. Now, obviously, a change of heart that extreme probably has something beneath the surface. So why do you think we are suddenly seeing people in more conservative circles talking about Title IX as important? And how does this relate to the LGBTQ conversation?
Yeah, I mean, this has been huge, and it's unfortunate. They're really weaponizing Title IX to use it as a tool for discrimination rather than what the purpose and intent of Title IX was and always has been since it was enacted 50 years ago, which is to broadly guarantee that all students have equal access to education, free from sex discrimination. But in the years since its passage, opponents have stopped at nothing to weaken protections and again to weaponize Title IX in order to discriminate against students. So, and in 2022, we've seen a record number of states enact or propose discriminatory laws targeting LGBTQI plus students, especially transgender and non-binary students, in the name of, and I put, air quotes, protecting women and girls' rights when it's actually not doing that. For example, many of these sport bans that are targeting trans, non-binary, and intersex students, are being enacted or proposed or introduced in the name of, saving women's sports when they actually don't do that. Like there are actual issues that impact gender inequity in sports, like resource inequities between girls and boys sports, pay inequities in professional sports. I mean, look at the lawsuit by the U.S. women's soccer team, rampant sexual abuse and harassment of student athletes. There are actual inequity issues. I mean, look at what happened with March Madness last year that exposed how the women's basketball teams were treated so differently than the men's basketball teams. Like they had inequitable facilities. Like there were photos showing like even where they were staying, where they worked out, the food, like everything was just like so subpar. It was not at the same level of what the men had. Those are the actual issues when it comes to gender inequity in sports. It's not allowing students to compete on sports consistent with their gender identity. And that's been really unfortunate and sad and harmful because they're targeting kids, and the benefits of participating in sports has been so well documented. And it's so important that every student can have that opportunity, to feel belonging, to feel safe, to feel a part of a community like that, and to not be discriminated against. Similarly, the same justification has been used for banning students from school restrooms that match their gender identity when there is no threat to cisgender women and girls. And, on these two issues at the National Women's Law Center, given our work on Title IX and our work around sexual harassment and also gender equity in athletics, we feel that it's so important for us as a women's rights organization to say, no, these discriminatory laws are harmful to women and girls, and trans women and girls are women and girls. And, there are actual issues that if these lawmakers do really care about gender inequities, they could be focused on. And so that has been a huge way that we've seen, Title IX be misinterpreted and really just turned on its head to perpetuate more discrimination. And it's concerning because I think, we've seen a lot of these discriminatory bans and bills in 2022. We're going to continue to see them. And, I think this is why students and families need even more assurance that the federal government supports them and will do whatever it takes to protect their civil rights and safety and opportunity to learn.
I completely agree with you. I think I actually wrote down what you were talking. Our opposition has weaponized Title IX, and it is one of the most. It's literally perverse as you start reading some of the ways they have twisted this entire conversation. So we have about 10 minutes left. I want to make sure we get to two more things. So the article that we shared this week mentioned that there are at least 22 attorneys general who have filed suit against the administration because of this most recent proposed guidance. So what happens next with that, and what should sort of the average person paying attention to this look out for?
Yeah, so I believe that was the guidance, I think, coming out of the Department of Agriculture around the definition of sex under Title IX and the Food and Nutrition Act for their the SNAP program, basically saying that they're interpreting sex discrimination consistent with, Bostock, what the Supreme Court has said, and what the understanding is, that has been affirmed in by other federal courts, and also, within the Biden administration. And, for that lawsuit, I think, the religious exemptions, it's really sad how a lot of the messaging from the far right has really twisted this issue and is really not addressing that at its core. It's about making sure that religious institutions and schools are not discriminating against LGBTQI plus students, including in the provision of, these meal programs. Right. Why would that be okay? I don't know why anyone would justify that type of discrimination being okay. But, so for the Title IX rule itself, because the Biden administration proposed changes to the Title IX rule, there is an opportunity right now for the public, for everyone, to submit comments and to let the federal government know how they feel about these proposed changes that would, codify protections against sex discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender identity, sex characteristics, that would undo the weakening of Title IX protections against sexual harassment, and also support pregnant parenting students. The comment period deadline is September 12th. And so there are organizations like ours and others that have created comment templates or portals or ways to enable the public to, weigh in and to show support for certain changes, and to also push the department where they want to push them. Right. So that may include, for example, on the athletics piece, we mentioned how these harmful sports bans, there's so many have been passed in 2022, and we're seeing more. There are probably going to be more coming out next in the next state legislative sessions. So for this issue in particular, the department in their proposed rules said that they were not going to address athletics and that they were going to leave it for another rulemaking. And so something that we've led with other organizations, other civil rights groups, other women's rights, gender justice, LGBTQI plus groups, is a letter urging the Biden administration to really act on that issue and to make clear that these state bans are discriminatory, and to issue an athletics rule that is inclusive of students who are trans, non-binary, and intersex to be able to play on sport teams without exclusion. And so this is also an opportunity to push the department, to do that and to really, ensure that the Title IX rule really fulfills its broad mandate, because there is a lot of pushback. There is a lot of opposition. There are a lot of people who are, using fear-mongering tactics and are trying to weaponize Title IX and are saying really horrible things through the comment process. So it's important that, we show our support for a fully inclusive Title IX rule.
Yeah, and I think that, I think sometimes when these comment periods open up, a lot of people don't think that it really matters or it seems really complex. But the truth is, every single one of those comments get read, every single one gets considered, and every single one of them gets tabulated one way or another. So I think doing that is important. And you mentioned that if you go to National Women's Law Center website, there is a portal, so that way it makes it easier for people to submit.
Yeah, so we have a sign-on comment, and you can read it. I'm hoping it's linked on our main page. I'm working on that, but the website is act.nwlc.org/a/Title IX, like Title IX -comment. And I'm happy to send you the link if that would be easier. I realized as I was saying, and I was like, I should probably just send the link, and maybe
we'll actually get the link from you, and we'll make sure that we post it in conjunction with this program, so that way people can click through to it. But it's pretty easy once you get in there to actually just do the sign on.
Yeah.
Excellent. So one last thing, we know that a lot of these issues play out obviously at a federal level, but they do play out at a very local level too. And Title IX has been a story of real success in places where people understand it and it is enforced, and real failures, frankly, in places where it is not enforced. And we know that it has always been kind of spotty with enforcement. It depends on where you are and what kind of training and what kind of work has been done. So for people who are looking at this issue on a local level, if they're looking at their local school districts, what are some of the things that they should be paying attention to? Are there any ways that this is showing up in local school board battles that people should just sort of have their antenna up that this is all connected?
Yes, definitely. I think especially, we're hearing more and more about like parent advocacy groups as well, who have been weighing in at the local level and attending school board meetings and trying to change policies. I mean, that's a very direct way to impact what a policy would be within a school district, because they're set by the school board. I mean, they have to comply with federal civil rights laws, and they have to comply with their state laws, but that could be an extremely important way to be engaged. And I we're a national organization. We don't have local chapters, but I know like there are local PFLAGs, and there are other groups that have, like GLSEN is another great group that advocates for LGBTQI+ students, and they have state and local chapters, I believe. So I think paying attention to what local organizations are doing and the opportunities that they're giving to families, communities, members, to be able to weigh in when there are, changes in policies that are being discussed, or opportunities to strengthen how schools are responding to sex discrimination. Similarly, and I know this is at a broader level, paying attention to what's happening in the states, and submitting testimony where you can when these issues are coming up before the state legislator. And again, like connecting with the groups who are directly supporting communities and families and kids, and engaging in that process.
Well, there's still so much work to do. And I think we're going to continue talking about this as it evolves. Shawale, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you for all the work that you're doing on this. And I'm seeing that Liz already has your link for those comments already on our scroll, so people can do that. So hopefully we'll drive some traffic. Thank you for being with us today. And please, please, please come back, because we definitely want to continue this conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And this is such an important conversation. I'm glad I could be a part of it.
Thank you. Well, everybody, that gets us to the end of yet another show. We'll be back with another good one for you next week. Make sure you check out that comments portal and add your support to this conversation. And while you're online, I will remind everybody that PFLAG is still running its Read with Love program, and we're not stopping. So if you want to learn a little bit more about how you can be part of restoring great books into your local libraries, visit us at pflag.org/readwithlove, because this is all connected, my friends. Every single week, we remind you, first of all, to please take care of yourself and get vaccinations as appropriate. But also, we leave you the exact same way, which is reminding you to run fast, laugh hard, and most of all, please be kind. We'll see you next week. If you need any help between now and then, visit us at pflag.org. Bye, everybody.